Everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to give just a little bit of time for folks to filter in and join us before kicking things off and getting us started. So welcome, and please sit tight just for a second as we give folks time to filter in. Okay, I think I'm going to get us started for today's webinar. Welcome. My name is Deborah Shushan. I'm the Director of Policy here at J Street. We have a very interesting and timely webinar for you today with a couple of great guests who I will introduce in just a moment. The topic of today's webinar is Israel and Palestine at The Hague, and we'll be talking about the ICC prosecutor's application for arrest warrants against leaders of Israel and of Hamas. We'll talk also about the International Court of Justice case brought by South Africa against Israel. We'll talk about reactions to all of this in Israel and the United States and what's likely to happen next. I'll just mention, in terms of how timely this is, that the House of Representatives will vote today, and I believe they are currently debating on the floor of the House right now, a bill that would impose sanctions not only on ICC personnel, but which would also require the United States government to sanction any foreign person who cooperates with the ICC's investigation into the US or Israel or US allies, like, for example, Israel. Furthermore, it would also sanction anyone who assists the ICC in prosecuting any foreign person that's a citizen or a lawful resident of an ally of the US that's not a party to the ICC. So interestingly, and very problematically, that would actually result in, let's say, the sanctioning of Qatari nationals who assist in prosecuting leaders of Hamas. Needless to say, you won't be surprised to hear that J Street opposes this legislation and is actively lobbying members of Congress to vote against it. But I mention that just to show how timely and important a topic this is, not only for Israelis and Palestinians, but also for those of us here in the United States. Now, as is always the case with our J Street Policy Center webinars, we always make time for a Q&A later on in our discussion. And of course, the way that we do that is to ask our audience members to put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll also mention that a recording of this discussion is going to be available later today on our YouTube channel for you to rewatch it and share. And I'm sure one of my colleagues will put the link to that in the chat. Our comms team is also going to be, excitingly enough, turning this webinar into a podcast. So for your friends who prefer to consume webinars in that format, they will be able to do that. I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't plug the J Street Policy Center's publications in general, and the number that we have that are related to the ICC, including one making the case against sanctioning the ICC. Those are all available on the Policy Center's webpage. And if you don't already receive our publications, you can sign up to do that on the web page. So with all of that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce our two guest speakers and experts today. They are Dr. Eliav Lieblich, who is a professor of law at Tel Aviv University. Eliav teaches and researches public international law, focusing on the laws regarding the use of force, international humanitarian law, and the history and theory of international law. He is also the author of a recent book with Eyal Benvenisti on occupation in international law, which I personally have found to be extremely helpful. And so thank you so much, Eliav, and welcome, and thanks for joining us today. We also have Dr. Dalia Scheinlin, who, of course, is a good friend of J Street and has appeared on many of our webinars in the past. She's a fellow at the Century Foundation, a public opinion expert, and an international political and strategic consultant, as well as a scholar and a writer. Dalia conducts the ongoing joint Israeli-Palestinian public opinion survey together with the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, led, of course, by our good friend, Dr. Khalil Shikaki. She authored the book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, and co-hosts the podcast, The Tel Aviv Review, on TLV1 Radio. It's hard to keep track of all of the great things that Dalia Scheinlin does. Thank you so much, Dalia, for joining us today.
Thank you for
So
having me.
these two guests are going to help us dig into what's happening at The Hague now, vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, and what it means for the future of the region, U.S. policy, and international order, nothing less than that. So I'd like to turn first. We're going to be looking at both the ICC and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. I'm going to turn to the ICC first. So just to remind folks of the recent development there, we had ICC prosecutor Karim Khan recently announced that he would be applying for applications for arrest warrants against 3 top Hamas leaders, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. So I'm going to turn to you, Eliav, first and ask you to talk to us a little bit, explain to us what the prosecutor's case entails and why he's bringing it at this time.
Hi. So first of all, thanks for inviting me and organizing. Well, so let me break down, the allegations right now. So concerning 3 Hamas leaders, so the allegations are basically concerning alleged crimes on October 7th, meaning extermination, which is just mass killing, murder, which is killing with a special intent, and taking hostages as a war crime. That's on October 7th. And then there's a list of allegations that concerns treatment of people in captivity, right? So that's rape and sexual violence, torture, other inhumane acts, outrages on personal dignity, and so on and so forth. And they're both the 3 Hamas leaders are charged both as co-perpetrators, meaning people who have personally planned these alleged actions, and as superiors, meaning that they're responsible for acts by their people subject to their authority, even if they have not ordered them directly, if they should have known or have known about what these people are going to do. So that's Hamas, right? Regarding Yoav Gallant and Netanyahu, so their allegations right now, but let me just add regarding Hamas that Khan has not applied so far for arrest warrants concerning sexual offenses allegedly committed on October 7th, right? Nor has he requested an arrest warrant concerning crimes during active hostilities, such as launching missiles at Israeli civilians. But he did say, that these can be added later, right? So what's happening now is not necessarily the end of the story. Right, regarding Gallant and Netanyahu, so here the allegations are basically, all of them are revolving around starvation, right? Starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. And this really pertains, so this allegation requires intentional deprivation of essential needs, right? And this revolves around statements by Gallant and Netanyahu in the beginning of the war, and then the ongoing allegations of inhibiting humanitarian aid throughout these months, right? So this is starvation, causing great suffering, and also causing deaths. So this also includes an extermination allegation due to the starvation, right? There are also counts here that have to do with attacks against civilians, also in the context of alleged starvation, right? So that would be alleged attacks against humanitarian aid compounds or convoys, right? Regarding Gallant and Netanyahu, it's also a co-perpetrator and a superior responsibility. But Khan added that he's looking to further evidence concerning bombardment and indiscriminate attacks against civilians. That can come later on and also extend to other personalities that can be subject to these proceedings. What's also important is that some of these allegations concerning Gallant and Netanyahu also phrased as crimes against humanity. That means it have to be pursuant to state policy and organized state policy against civilians, and they identified, Khan identified such a policy aiming to achieve three things. One is, two of them are maybe legitimate, right? One, destroying Hamas and bringing back the hostages, but also another state policy, which is to collectively punish the Palestinian population. So these are kind of the allegations. Deborah, you wanted to ask me another thing about this? Why now?
Sure. Well, yes, I want to know why now, but maybe let me add another question to that. Why not? Which is the issue of equivalency, in terms of the timing, right? There were the charges announced both against Netanyahu and Gallant and the Hamas leaders at the same time. And that was something that the Biden administration took umbrage at, and a lot of people were certainly, at the very least, uncomfortable with. Does it imply equivalency?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because honestly, there's a lot, to discuss about these allegations, a lot of interesting legal questions and complicated legal questions. But the equivalency issue of all of these questions is probably the weakest argument and is a spin. And I was really kind of surprised that it was picked up by serious people. The reason that Khan made the announcements at the same time, just think about the counterfactual. What would have happened if you wouldn't have announced them in the same time? So we would now be discussing, right, forever, why Hamas first or why Israel first, and does this imply anything, right? So we didn't really have a choice. And also, the fact that you're alleging, war crimes or other international crimes against politicians does not necessarily draw an equivalency between the political entities that they represent. The rules apply equally to all. It doesn't matter if you're a democracy, a dictatorship, or a terrorist organization. In terms of how you fight and how you conduct your operations, there are rules that apply to everyone. So I don't find this claim convincing. I understand why politically, people are raising it, because it's kind of like it's catchy in a way, but when you know the issues, it's really, to me, meaningless.
All right, thank you so much for that, Eliav. Delia, I'd like to turn to you now and ask what kind of impact this announcement had in Israel. And in particular, was it actually beneficial for Netanyahu? What was the impact in terms of public opinion? How did he spin it? You're our ultimate expert on Israeli public opinion, so I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. In terms of the impact, we can break it down into the impact on Israel's policy and the impact on Israel's politics, except that with regard to Israeli policy, nobody can really say for sure because there are many things that have an impact on Israeli policy. Netanyahu is balancing, myriad considerations, including the instability of his coalition, the pressure for a ceasefire, of course, long before this happened, the families of hostages, etc. Now, there is evidence that in some ways the IDF might be moving towards something like a lower intensity approach, but we've seen phases like that in the past. The actions are still very, very much ongoing around the Philadelphia corridor. But you could also argue that because the IDF hasn't gone completely into the city of Rafah, as we assume the government wanted to, maybe there's been some constraints, but that could also be because of American pressure, which is, I think, more likely. I think that of all the various factors acting on Netanyahu's decision-making in the war, the ICC is there, but I would imagine we're going to talk about the ICJ. I think the ICJ was probably had a bigger impact on policy, but again, there's no way to read. We're only reading into which of those factors is having the biggest impact on what's going on the ground. In terms of public opinion, however, that's another interesting point. Netanyahu has been seeing a slight revival in public opinion. I mean, I will just orient everybody. Immediately after the war, polls showed that the situation for the Likud, Netanyahu, his coalition, and general trust in the government was catastrophic, right? They immediately, the entire coalition lost about 1/3 of its support. Netanyahu's party went down to about half of its current Knesset strength in surveys. And that situation broadly lasted for a number of months. Netanyahu and Likud began to see a slight recovery in surveys, but it predated the ICC. It actually started around mid-April, and I attributed it primarily to the Iranian attack. Well, Israel's, first of all, the strike on the Al-Quds generals in Damascus, followed by the Iranian attack, which made Israelis terrified of opening up another front, and of course, possibility of a historic full-out war with Iran. But then Israel managed to respond in a way that Israelis sort of appreciated, and he got a little bit of a boost. It's been very incremental, this recovery, very small, but it's real. And the other thing that's happening at the same time is that his closest competitor party, the party of Benny Gantz, who entered his war coalition and is a cabinet minister in the war cabinet, has been losing support for various reasons that are a little less related to our topic today. So all of that combines to make Netanyahu seem a little bit stronger in public opinion surveys. And that trend continued. Again, it's very small and incremental trend. In a way, it boils down to a couple of survey questions. There's no question that Israelis respond to things like the ICC with a great measure of defensiveness. And we do have data on that. I'm happy to talk about actual public responses, public opinion responses to the ruling itself. But right now, I think that it's hard to attribute any of these things only to the ICC, is what I'm saying. It certainly does reinforce Israel's sense of defensiveness, Israel's sense that the world is against it, and I'm, conjuring the Israeli way of thinking about this. And it certainly provides a message for Netanyahu and his government to use, because, I'm getting a little bit ahead of some of the questions possibly. But I will just also point out that this draws, this kind of thing from any international court draws an across the board defensive reaction against it, well beyond just the right-wing coalition parties. So given that everybody's kind of unified in Israel with, pretty much across the political spectrum around the message that Netanyahu wants to have, it does play well for him roughly. But he has lots of other things that are, still reinforcing the negative attitudes that people have towards him right now as well.
So just following up on that, Dalia, what is the impact then of to the extent that you can kind of suss it out, of the U.S. government reaction to the prosecutor's warrants, right? You have the Biden administration, of course, pretty clearly condemning the prosecutor's decision. Then you have Congress inviting Netanyahu to come and address a joint session, even after the prosecutor makes this announcement.
Yeah.
So how does that play in Israel?
Well, there are a couple of interesting things. First of all, remember that invitation was bipartisan, which played particularly well in Israel. That's one of the interesting things going on. The other thing is that while Biden certainly condemned the prosecutor, he also came out against sanctions on the ICC, even though he is now facing the challenge that you mentioned. Both, there certainly is the House vote going on today, and we know that about 19 House Democrats have signed the letter urging the administration to support sanctions against the ICC. We also have seen the letter that came out, I guess, from Republican senators maybe in early May, which was really worded in terms that frankly shocked me. I mean, it sounded like Tony Soprano. I can only read it in that way. It said, how dare you threaten our enemies? We will target you. I mean, it used very militant language. And so I think that Israelis are certainly not following every single, development in this case, but they absolutely fall back on the sense that America will fix this problem. I mean, I think that is a broad-ranging, hope/expectation in Israeli society. And I should say that this gets into, a very sensitive situation with the U.S. and Israel right now. I have, been doing a lot of research on this issue. I have a long article about it recently. There is basically a long history of various kinds of tensions and crises with the U.S. and Israel, but generally the U.S. does not actually use policy tools to try to constrain Israel. And that's been one of the differences this time. For the first time in, by my estimate, about over 30 years, right, since the early 1990s, roughly, the U.S. has begun the Biden administration has begun to roll out some very, very incremental, limited policy tools to actually try to deter Israel from, continuing on its current course and pressure it to change direction. So, and there have been very, very open attempts by Netanyahu to defy Biden and provoke, or take a stance, which largely we assume is for domestic consumption, because there is, this is an attitude, a stance with relation to primarily Democratic presidents, let's be honest, that he thinks plays well with his base at home. And so there is this background for months now that Israelis have been aware that there's something beyond the usual ups and downs of a special relationship between Israel and the US that has been very worrying, also because it comes naturally on top of a very widespread trend of global isolation of Israel that itself goes well beyond the kinds of opprobrium, condemnation, rhetorical pressure on Israel that Israelis have come to, they become used to it over the years. They become accustomed to it. So all of what we're seeing now is definitely, a step, a more intense sense of global isolation. Then you have the US pressure going beyond the usual, little difficulties with friends. And then you have this back and forth about whether the Biden administration is truly on Israel's side with this stuff. Yes, rejecting the ICC's, the prosecutor's request, but also sort of doing this dance of trying to reject sanctions at the same time. Frankly, I have to say that it reflects a great deal of uncertain policy from the Biden administration to trying to walk this very, very fine line, which I can understand, as a person who likes to look for the middle path myself, but it's coming across as pretty incoherent. And I think that, from the Israeli perspective, they are hoping and assuming that America will always be on its side. But they are also perfectly willing to be furious. They, I mean, very broadly, politicians, the public, certainly the right-wing politicians, are perfectly willing to kind of drop the affection for America, or, and express this very openly when Biden does something that, let's say, contradicts the right-wing perspective on what should happen in Israel. And so they're watching every move. And I think that the American administration has not really internalized that the bear hug approach, of trying to gain, very high level credibility with Israel, very, strong image of support, and even, grounded in extraordinary policy support, right? Financial, military, political cover for Israel in general and throughout this war. None of that matters when America does something that seems to contradict what the right wing in Israel wants, because they will very publicly then criticize Israel and particularly describe American actions in a partisan way. So that's the other thing we're seeing, is an increasing partisanship within American attitudes towards Israel, but also an increasingly partisan sense of, appreciation or not appreciation for America's role in Israel, such that the right is much more willing to see America as a fair weather friend and portray it like that, whereas the center and left feels like Israel must go much further in trying to accommodate what America wants.
Thank you so much for that analysis, Dalia. I want to return to the issue that you and I both talked about a little bit regarding sanctions, and the possibility, the fact that Republicans in the House, and as you've noted, a relatively, hopefully just small number of Democrats are also backing the sanctions efforts. The fact that President Biden, the Biden administration, have come out very clearly against sanctions, even as they have obviously seriously criticized the ICC prosecutor. Eliav, I'd like to turn to you on this issue of sanctions. And can you give us a little bit of background, if possible, on where we've seen sanctions used? I mean, I can think of a couple of cases. I know, Russia under Vladimir Putin has imposed sanctions on the ICC following the ICC case against Putin. President Trump, of course, here in the United States, also imposed ICC sanctions, which then President Biden rescinded early in his term. How do you see the issue of sanctions, and in terms of normatively, whether it's a good or a bad thing, whether it makes any sense, and how they have or haven't been kind of used against the ICC over time?
Well, as far as I know, beyond Russia and the US, I don't know of official sanctions that were imposed on the ICC. You know, in terms of just kind of formal black letter law, so the Rome Statute in Article 70 includes an offense which is, against administration of justice and imposing sanctions, harassing, intimidating ICC officials can give rise to international criminal liability in front of the ICC. So that's something to consider. And just to bracket, we also know the reports in The Guardian in 972 about the alleged involvement of the ex-Mossad chief in such actions, which clearly fall under Article 70 in my view. So that's just formal law. In terms of effectiveness, I think it's a kind of mixed bag. Trump administration was very aggressive against the ICC. And we know that at the end of the day, this prosecutor kind of let the US go in terms of his investigations in Afghanistan. And that was phrased as, well, I'm going to focus on the most kind of egregious offenses, and that would be the Taliban, not US personnel. And of course, that could be, of course, reasonable. But then because of the proximity to previous sanctions, and then, the new Biden administration, so you can also kind of think whether there was some real politics involved here. So that somebody might say that that would be effective, but of course we don't know if that's exactly the reason. In terms of Russia and in terms of like the ex-Mossad chief's alleged involvement, I don't see that it has been effective. I think officials tend to double down when faced with such a threats, especially when they have a backing. The ICC is located in the Netherlands, and I think they're well protected by local security agencies. So in that sense, I wouldn't kind of think that these moves will be effective ultimately. But yeah, I mean, time will tell.
Can I add something on that issue very quickly?
Sure. Yeah.
I think we tend to see this issue as a matter of the most powerful countries in the world having, being able to kind of engineer the international system in a way that benefits them. But I just think it's important to note that the ICC is a precarious concept, right? It's a new institution. The Rome Statute is relatively new. The Rome Statute was signed in 1998. The court only became active in 2002. And there are a lot of countries that have difficulty accepting the legitimacy. But I think, even a few years ago, there was a serious sort of a groundswell of anger among numerous African countries that the vast majority of people who've been indicted by the ICC were from African nations. And a number of them from the African Union threatened to withdraw from the court. And I think that we should see this within the broader picture of the strength of the international system, and the fact that it's still trying very hard to gain that legitimacy. It very much appears to what we tend to call the global South, a little bit inaccurately, that this is all really a sham and is masterminded by the powerful countries of the world. And I think that because the world does break down over this issue, over the Israeli-Palestinian issue, whether we like it or not. This is really being seen as a test by many countries around the world about whether a country that many see as both a Western country and an American ally, such a strong American ally, can actually be judged according to the same standards as the less powerful countries. So it is important to remember that if the court really suffers damage, because of whatever happens in the fallout from this, that will be a pile-on to a long history of the court not ever really having gained the full legitimacy that it would need to implement international justice, which in itself is a precarious prospect and fairly new in the course of human history.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Looking forward, I want to bring in some of the questions that we are getting in the Q&A. Lots of great questions. Thank you so much to our engaged audience members. I'll try to get to as many as I can, as usual. But taking a step, kind of looking into the future here, one of the questions that we have has to do with the ICC's power of enforcement, right? And so if the next step will be for the pretrial chamber, if I have this correct, to consider the prosecutor's request. If the warrants are in fact issued, what is, how does the process move forward? What powers of enforcement does the ICC have, both vis-a-vis warrants, and also, Eliav, you were talking about possible violations of the Rome Statute in terms of interrupting the process of justice. Does the ICC actually have any way to enforce infractions against the Rome Statute? So, Eliav, I'm going to toss all of that over to you.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's international crimes or crimes against administration of justice, at the end of the day, the ICC is completely dependent on the cooperation and let's say the grunt work of law enforcement agencies of the state parties, right? So it always works through the state parties, right? So in that way, there is no way, to enforce its warrants unless the state parties comply with it. So, I mean, you asked what's going forward, so I assume going forward, I'm assuming you're asking about the implications of the arrest warrants. Well, I mean, for Netanyahu and Gallant, look, so Israel is not a state party to the Rome Statute, so it's not under no obligation to cooperate or to arrest these individuals. But most immediately, they would not, if the arrest warrants are issued, which I think will actually happen, they would not be able to travel to ICC member states because they would be under an obligation to arrest them. And I think that these states, most of them have made clear that they respect the ICC's independence. And I don't think they want, I don't see Germany really excited about the prospects of arresting Netanyahu, but they would probably quietly tell him not to come. That's what South Africa did with Putin in the BRICS summit last year. In a way, he joined through Zoom. So that's a very significant limitation for a state head of state not to be able to travel to most of the country's allies. It also has broader ramifications concerning issues like arms trade with Israel, because if leaders are suspected of committing international crimes, that can create international and domestic law obligations in various states to refrain from actually providing weapons. If these weapons are under control of somebody who's a suspect of committing these crimes, so that can generate this obligation. And domestic courts in various states can intervene, and we've seen this already happening. And telling their government, no, you cannot sell these weapons. We have an ICC warrant, so that causes a strong presumption that there's a problem, right? And it's also, of course, an unprecedented blow to their reputation. It makes every kind of international interaction with these people to be, becomes very awkward. And I don't think, many European leaders would not be, wanting to share kind of the frame with somebody who has an ICC arrest warrant. So that would very, complicate things for them. We can discuss implications for Sinwar and the others also, if you want.
Would you like to add something on that?
I mean, I think, the implications for Hamas leaders de facto are less dramatic, both because, to begin with, Hamas is labeled as a terrorist organization in many of the relevant states to begin with, and they don't travel much. And, to me, it seems any situation in which they actually turn up and, potentially, being able to be apprehended by Western or ICC member state, I think Israel would get to them first, right? So I don't see here something too threatening practically for them. But in legal terms, what's interesting is the state of Palestine, as opposed to Israel, is a state party to the ICC, and they're under an obligation to arrest these Hamas leaders if an ICC warrant is issued, and also to cooperate with the court. Now, right now, they don't control Gaza, and it seems kind of not science fiction that they would do so. But if we hopefully get to a ceasefire, and there might be some kind of power sharing arrangement. So that can really complicate things, and I don't know whether the Palestinians are actually, thinking through the implications of that. Probably they are, but that can be complicated. Also, in terms of reputation to Hamas leaders, well, I think some circles have shown some sympathy for Hamas, and they would have to come to terms with the fact that you have this body in which they want to act against Israel, actually saying, well, there's a real problem here. So I mean, but yeah, I won't say more on this.
That's really helpful. Dalia.
I really want to reinforce the last point that Eliab started to make, which is I think ties into what we said before. Why did they release the request for warrants all at once? I mean, for all of the deep polarization around this issue in so many parts of the world, if you're one of these people who are on, team, let's just say for the sake of argument, team Palestine, anti-Israel, you have to read through all of these very severe accusations against Hamas if you want to get to the part about how, about Israel's alleged crimes, and vice versa, of course. So, I mean, there is a power to doing that together. It kind of says to all, I don't know if the prosecutor intended this. I have little doubt the prosecutor tries not to get involved in global politics, and little doubt that everybody is influenced by global politics. But I think that there is a power in having those things laid out side by side. You simply can't be, an enthusiastic supporter of the court calling for the warrant against Israeli leaders unless you read through all of these alleged crimes of Hamas. I also think it's worth just adding a couple of things about, the enforcement itself, as Eliab pointed out, is, it depends on the states. We don't know. And I mean, I do think it's a severe limitation for leaders at that level not to be able to travel to 124 different countries, many of them Israeli allies. But there are other added factors that even before anybody enforces these warrants will create huge hassles. You already mentioned the difficulty of countries not wanting to export weapons. Just to point out that would be coming on top of initial, there have already been moves by certain countries due to the war itself to not export certain arms to Israel. Canada has announced that it won't export arms to Israel. Italy, months into the war, said that at the beginning it had stopped exporting arms. You might think that's not that important. It's only a tiny portion of Israel's arms imports, but I found one report that listed Italy as number 3, well below the US, of course, but still, Netherlands has declined to export certain parts that Israel needs, for replacing and maintaining its equipment. So these are trends that are already in place, and they will accumulate if that goes further. The other thing is that, remember, the court, I mean, Israelis in some ways, Israelis in the know about what to expect from the ICC were, struck by the fact that the ICC only requested, or the prosecutor only requested warrants against the prime minister and the defense minister. That, in a way, is like a threat or a warning that this is one level. But if this goes on in the next phase, if things don't change, this could also eventually touch regular soldiers, reservists. I mean, people, it is a people's army, and all of those people will be exposed, which I think is, something that, again, Israelis have a kind of a suppression mechanism. Once the headlines were gone and they didn't have to think about it, it vanished. But it's there. The pressure is accumulating. The concerns and fears about, how can we live here, I think, is accumulating in Israel because of these people. I think people noticed that signal that, the possibility of future calls for arrest of regular soldiers and reservists could also happen.
Thank you so much for that. I still have a number of questions I would love to get to regarding the ICC, but I do want to make sure that we get to the International Court of Justice case brought by South Africa. So we're gonna pivot to that, and we'll see. Hopefully, maybe we'll have a chance to return to the ICC. But moving to the ICJ, of course, in December, South Africa brought its case against Israel, accusing Israel of violating the Genocide Convention by committing genocide against Palestinians during the Gaza war. South Africa requested that the ICJ indicate provisional measures. And while the ICJ did not go as far in its January ruling as South Africa requested, it did rule accepting the plausibility of at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa and promulgating some interim provisional measures. And so, Eliav, I wonder if you could jump in and talk a little bit about that January ruling and the rulings that have happened since, including the most recent ruling that pertains to Israel's operation in Rafah.
Well, where to begin? There's a lot to say. First of all, just to frame the issue. So what we're at the stage of provisional measures, right? So when a case is filed to the ICJ by a state, so the applicant can request provisional measures, which are actually interim orders meant to safeguard its rights pending the final judgment, right? So, and the idea is, that the rights will not be destroyed or exhausted before the final judgment is rendered, because the final judgment takes long years to be rendered. And in this process, so the applicant has to show basically three things. First, that it has plausible rights under a treaty, that there is a danger of irreparable harm to these rights by the time the final judgment is rendered, and that there's a link between the rights in danger and the provisional measure it requests to safeguard them. So the plausibility is kind of the main issue here. And there's a lot of, and the court ruled in all of its, all of the three provisional rulings on the provisional measures, that South Africa has demonstrated plausibility of some rights under the convention. And there's a lot of, vagueness about what this means, and also confusion between the judges themselves. And we see two extreme readings of what the ICJ said on this context. One is that the court found that there's plausible genocide. So that's like the pro-Palestine camp saying. The other is, well, the court really didn't say anything beyond the fact that South Africa has crossed a very low threshold of plausible rights under the convention, which doesn't even imply plausible violations. And we know that the ex-ICJ President Donahue has been interpreted as adopting this latter view, although it's not exactly what she says. I think both views are incorrect. This court says at least some rights are plausible, which leaves open the question what exact rights under the convention, it is referring to. So in this sense, saying that the court found plausible genocide is misleading. On the other hand, it makes no sense to say that, well, the court said there are plausible rights and that's it, because everybody has plausible rights under the convention at all times. So that means everybody, every state can always get provisional measures. That makes no sense whatsoever. And the court did refer to facts in the ground, which it found concerning and leading to possible irreparable harms to rights. But the fact that this is unclear is entirely the court's fault, and it should develop a more coherent doctrine of provisional measures. And I think this would probably happen throughout the years. Well, maybe I'll stop here, and I can, if you have follow-up questions.
And particularly with regard to the most recent ruling vis-a-vis Rafah, do you think it's likely that there will be any real-world impact to that?
First of all, I think that's a sub-question of does the court, or why the court didn't order Israel to stop the war, whether in general or in Rafah specifically. And here, there are three problems here. One is that the court doesn't have jurisdiction over Hamas, right? So an order for a unilateral ceasefire would be a bit awkward and also ineffective, because a second later Israel would say, well, Hamas is still fighting, right? And second, for that to happen, South Africa has to show plausibility that Israel's war as a whole and in itself causes plausible harm to convention rights, which is a very kind of high threshold. And I think most realistically, the court is maybe kind of concerned not to grant orders in which it knows that there's absolutely no chance of compliance. It did so in Ukraine versus Russia, and I don't think it helped the court too much. So regarding specifically about Rafah, if that what what you were asking, so here the court kind of said something ambiguous. On the one hand, it didn't order Israel to stop the Rafah operation. On the other hand, it's impossible to understand the order as just saying, well, you can continue as is, because the court found that the Rafah operation as conducted raises plausible rights, whatever that means to convention rights. So I think, the court basically tells Israel one of two things here. Either you change your MO in Rafah immediately, stop this method of mass evacuations to areas in which humanitarian access is very problematic, to say the least, or dramatically change the humanitarian situation in these areas to which people are evacuated. And fighting under current conditions cannot continue. This is how I understand the Rafah ruling. Now, whether it has a real world impact, so like Dalia said in the beginning, I think it's hard to, I think Israel did step back from the most, maybe, I don't want to say dramatic, because what happened is dramatic, but the most all-out offensive on Rafah. And that could be due to the ICC, the ICJ, and also other types of international pressure. It's all part of a process in which international law and politics kind of complement each other. But it did say, well, we're not going to conduct our operations in a way that will risk convention rights. But I think, again, here the court said something a bit ambiguous, and a lot of people are frustrated with this type of ambiguity because they expected something more, but I'm not sure the court can deliver it.
So Dalia, let me build on this in terms of, what's likely to happen next. So we talked about the ICC, which, does not have independent powers of enforcement, so it goes to the member states. With the ICJ, the way that it works is that any enforcement would have to go to the UN Security Council. So what do you see as likely or not likely to happen there?
I mean, I will borrow a line from my dear colleague Gershom Gorenberg, who says, "I don't report on the future," because it's really all very, very speculative. But I think that, again, we have to understand that Israelis, let me just set the stage of, we're having this discussion about these international institutions and their rulings in good faith, right? We assume that they're facing dilemmas and they're trying their best as best they can to reach, the right steps to maybe sometimes take a nuanced line. The Israeli public, the Israeli political leadership, and I mean, like I said before, this crosses ideological lines. Most of the Israeli party leaders, for example, they see these processes as somewhere between a farce and anti-Israel or virulently anti-Semitic. Okay, and this is the starting point. So their basic approach is not how do we maneuver in terms of our fight. Now, it could be the case, like I said before, and as Eliav just said, at the highest levels in terms of decision making about what's going on the ground in Rafah, that there is attention, in a serious way to these rulings. But at the level of social discourse, all of Israel, and I mean, again, top to bottom, right? Political leadership, political elites, and the public expect Israel to be able to somehow get around this, and that somehow always goes back to the US. And so it's always a question of whether the US will use its veto in the UN Security Council. Israelis for many, many years have expected, automatically that the US would use that veto reflexively. And for the most part, most of the time, America has used that veto reflexively, except for a very limited number of times, including recently when America has abstained. And even then, in the most recent time when America abstained, allowing the ceasefire resolution to pass, it did so in a way that, first of all, the ceasefire resolution itself was somewhat limited, but also immediately the UN ambassador basically immediately stated that the resolution was not binding because it's not under Chapter 7. And I mean, there's this, as I said before, a sort of this and that approach to American policy. So we don't know. But I really do think that given the American, as I read the American position, I should say the Biden administration position, going a little bit this way and a little bit that way, I think the ICC remains a bit of a red line. I mean, Biden was clear that he didn't want sanctions, but other than that, as you pointed out in the beginning, the first reaction is that this is a bad thing. It shouldn't have happened. And I have very little doubt that Israelis are probably right to depend on America to veto any sort of resolution like that at the UN Security Council. I mean, again, even though I don't like to predict too much, because I think America is, considering that series of policy steps it can take to constrain Israel's actions beyond just rhetoric. I think that the idea that America would let that kind of a resolution pass the UN Security Council seems a bit far-fetched for me.
If I just can jump in on this. So the term enforcement is used a lot, and we think to be fixated in Israel, of course, the question of enforcement, whenever you have such a ruling or a resolution, whatever the first question, the media or everybody, on the street, how is this enforced, right? So we tend to have this kind of binary view of enforcement. Either somebody comes and arrests you or it's meaningless. But international law doesn't work like this. Not Security Council resolutions, not ICJ decisions or judgments, not ICC arrest warrants. The game is a game of a process, a long-term process in which these rulings are then utilized to kind of delegitimize an actor. They're used as signals for public opinion. They're used as signals for domestic courts to intervene. So, even for demonstrators, right, are using these terms. So we have to look on, when we're discussing the effects of such rulings in a much less kind of a stringent way of whether somebody has been arrested or sanctions have been applied, right? So it's much more complex.
So we are unbelievably winding to the end of our time, which is, there are so many more questions that we could discuss on this issue of the international court cases vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. But I do want to be sure to give both of you an opportunity to share final thoughts with us. And as you think about them, I'm going to put a few issues out that it would be great if one or both of you could address that I think are important. One pertains specifically to the ICC case, and that is the question of complementarity. There's been a lot of question about whether Israel was given the due opportunity to pursue the cases against its own leaders in its domestic courts before the prosecutor announced his intention to pursue the arrest warrant. So that's one. Secondly, another issue that I think is really interesting is Israel's historical approach to the international courts, to the ICC, signing the Rome Statute, not joining the ICC. That's a question of interest. And the last question that I want to throw out there that a lot of our folks have put in variations into the Q&A is the question of politicization, and to what extent you two see one or both of these courts as politicized, as acting unfairly against Israel, as treating Israel differently than other countries. So those are a few questions to give you food for thought as you give us your final comments. Who would like to jump in first? Eliav,
I'm happy to talk, or Eliav, whatever.
Either one.
I'll be really brief. Look, complementarity is a huge issue. There is a technical argument by Israel or some Israelis that the initial investigation in the situation in Palestine did not involve these types of crimes, namely starvation. So the fact that the prosecutor just issued this arrest warrant without kind of giving or a request for arrest warrant without giving Israel a chance to investigate this crime is somehow could be problematic. I mean, there are a lot of technical issues here. I won't get into that, but the issue with this specific crime is that really goes, kind of to the head of the policy, decision-making kind of apparatus. And I think it's safe to assume that many of these policies receive some kind of legal advice from now the same bodies who are actually required to investigate this policy, right? Because in Israel, the Attorney General, the legal advisor, and the prosecutor is the same body. So to be honest, I mean, again, like Dalia said, I don't want to speculate, but it's hard to me to envision an investigation opening against, concerning these specific crimes. I would be extremely surprised if this happened, and I think that the Attorney General already said this is baseless. So I don't know if the complementary issue here is actually a real one. Of course, complementarity is a huge issue in other contexts, namely, investigating actual hostilities on the ground. Regarding Israel's historic approach, maybe I'll leave that to Dalia. I mean, about politicization, I think, every individual that has been targeted or indicted in the ICC, every state that has lost a case in front of the ICJ always says it's politicization. I think we are seeing, a really unprecedented kind of legal onslaught. I don't say onslaught judgmentally, but in terms of just how, it is on the ground against Israel here, which people see as evidence for this politicization. But I think a lot of it has also to do with the fact, beyond, the awful situation in Gaza, that this is a moment of pivot in which a lot of actors want to challenge what they see as the U.S. Domination of the international institutions, and going, through Israel is a proxy to do it, in a way, right? So this is a type of politicization. Doesn't mean necessarily that their arguments are wrong, but that explains some of the motivations of some states pursuing, from Nicaragua versus Germany and stuff like that. But I think a lot of the problems in the ICJ specifically is because of the very low, some would say ridiculously low threshold for provisional measures, right? To get provisional measures, you really have to show, there's no real engagement with evidence on that stage. But then, if it would be hard for Israel to make this argument because the ICJ applied the same threshold to Gambia versus Myanmar, and then even to, to Ukraine versus Russia, and to backtrack later. So I don't think it's if reading the judges, you can actually see that I think some of the judges that you would say, come from countries who are more hostile to Israel, I don't see them as having pushed a, more kind of extreme agenda. So I don't take these allegations. I don't have evidence for these allegations right now.
Thanks, Eliav. Over to you, Dalia, for your final thoughts.
Okay, I'm not sure if I can state it any better than Eliav, but I'll just pick up on some of the points. The question of complementarity, I think, was really, Israelis did a crash course on what it means, and why it was so important. And I think that they see it, of course, as political, the decision of the court or the prosecutor to ask for warrants, because it projects a lack of trust by the court in either, in Israeli democracy, basically. I mean, Israelis became well aware, very fast history lesson, that this is the first time that the prosecutor is recommending an arrest warrant for the sitting, incumbent leaders of a democratic country, which is how Israelis see their country. And, Israelis have long since completely disconnected issues of the conflict and occupation from their self-perception of democratic institutions, particularly their perceptions of the courts. And so, either the International Criminal Court is either saying your courts are not independent, which is not really true, or they're saying your courts cannot be expected to rule seriously in a way that would actually put the policymakers responsible for the war or occupation, on the dock. And by the way, I should mention, at the ICJ, there has been an ongoing investigation into a different case brought by Palestinians looking at the legality of occupation in itself. That is also an ongoing case. And the ICC had already a few years ago been, done I don't know if you call it pretrial work, looking into whether it can investigate other occupation-related crimes as well. And so these things were already kind of playing out in Israeli society, but I think they say something else. For one thing, they say that to Israelis that it's unfair because Israel's a democracy, and how dare they, try to persecute/prosecute Israelis as, because we have a legitimate democracy. But I also think that, that it tends to be seen as anti-Israel in the Israeli perspective. What I think Israelis are missing is that, of course, you cannot separate Israel's state institutions, its civilian institutions, from democracy, from the occupation and the conflict. That has been a self-deception, and frankly, an outward-facing deception as well. Purposeful, not purposeful, calculated, not calculated. But pretty much since the earliest years of occupation, all branches of the Israeli state, the civilian state, have been involved in occupation policy. And so the court is basically like, calling that out for what it is. Israelis are having a hard time internalizing it. But the fact is that, I pointed out the earlier cases also to make the point that the courts have not rushed ahead to persecute Israel. In other words, Israelis are always seeing this as an anti-Israel, cabal, essentially. Israelis see the entire international system as frankly existing in order to torment Israel, whereas these cases have moved ahead. The original cases that I mentioned before this have moved ahead very slowly. Nobody's rushed, into them. And in the meantime, the court has been busy, though both of the courts have been busy ruling and trying and hearing many, many other cases from many other countries, as we've pointed out throughout the course of this call. And so I think what Israelis are failing to internalize, and I'm constantly trying to get this across, is that these institutions exist, independently of Israel. They're not there in order to persecute Israel or prosecute Israel. They have been busy for all of their history looking at other cases. They are seeking to implement law, and something that is a very audacious project, frankly, of international justice. And I don't think there is ever such a thing as a pure separation of law and politics. Law exists in the world, and I think that has to be understood.
Well, on that note, I want to thank both of you for sharing your insights with us today. This has been a great discussion. Obviously, we could continue it. The issue is obviously not going to go away, and I imagine that we at the Policy Center will come back to it. But I want to thank so much both of you. I want to thank our audience and all of the great questions that you've put into the Q&A. Apologies for those that we didn't get to, but again, thanks to our wonderful speakers. And I'm going to call our webinar to a close. So have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.